and welcome back to the Probiotics Theater. Our next session of the day is linking mental health and the microbiome, presented by Jennifer Cooper, the president of Alternative Laboratories. Jennifer has spent over 25 years in consumer healthcare, including supplement, food, and over-the-counter drug companies. In this presentation, discover more about the emerging research driving innovation opportunities and reshaping the category for mental health. Without further ado, Jennifer, you have the floor.
Thank you to Vitafoods and to Informa and the organizers of this conference. They do a great job in terms of developing content that is timely, trending, and also sometimes urgent. And there's no subject that it falls better into those categories than that of mental health. We have had this experience globally, a pandemic that has been related to respiratory health, and the 2 years that we've been processing through all of that, and we're still not wrapping this up. And we've been surprised by, I think a lot of experts have been surprised by how the pandemic has evolved. But the next pandemic, experts are really predicting, and that is as we have had isolation and quarantine, as we have issues with our health and our loved ones' health, it's leading to a pandemic of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and the subjects that we're following, not just subjects that have been ill and that we're following for long haul syndrome, 55% of them are manifesting some sort of mental illness. And so the pandemic is, the coronavirus pandemic is leading to a global mental health pandemic. This slide is courtesy of IPA, but you can see that the first indication, the direct impact of coronavirus, right, is that we're all focused on immunity. The second impact of the coronavirus is that we're looking at proactively at our health, and that it's evolving into this brain health and also holistic concept of our health. It's not our imagination. It's not our imagination that that the burden on individuals and families and globally on society is increasing. So we estimate that during this time frame, we've added 50 million cases to major depressive disorder and almost 80 million cases of anxiety and depression. So it brings us to this idea of, can we cure mental illness? It's not really a disease that we think of as curative. The psychotropic drugs have certainly offered a tremendous amount of benefit to millions of individuals when looking at specific symptoms or a very small subsegment of its etiology. But mental health challenges are among the most poorly diagnosed. In addition to that, the efficacy of those drugs is incredibly low. The side effects are very high. And to exacerbate all of that, the compliance of patients taking these drugs is very low. The development of psychiatric drugs has certainly lagged behind the tsunami of patients that need additional care. there's been some interesting studies also that on several types of mental illness, we're not really doing any better than we were doing in the 1990s in terms of mitigating the impact of the disease, both economically, socially, and medically. The situation, which is mental health experts are describing as a crisis, really needs a revolution in terms of how we look at and manage mental health. And what would a mental health revolution look like? Well, for sure, because the etiology of these diseases is so complex and that it's not just one mitigating factor, for sure we would benefit from a more holistic approach. There's a lot to be said for preventive medicine in this area, complementary medicine and adjunctive therapies, something that's accessible, something that's affordable, something safe. And since this is something that is a challenge throughout the entire lifespan, something that's appropriate throughout our lifespan. And that brings us to the decoding of the microbiome. The work that we see on the microbiome is really the Rosetta Stone of human health. That's a big statement. We're going to be able to, and this is not just in mental health, in many diseases, the sequencing and understanding of the microbiome is going to provide significant insight into some of the most refractory and challenging conditions and many of them that are related to modern lifestyle. And it's not surprising if we think that the microbiome mitigates or is involved in those diseases, that lifestyle is an important factor, because we can see the difference in microbiomes between the Western world and the developing world. When we look specifically at the different areas that microbiome medicine is going to revolutionize, you can see the gut-brain axis, which we've spent a lot of time talking about, but also very popular and under significant research is gut-lung, gut-skin, gut-heart disease, other metabolic diseases. And many of these diseases, including skin diseases and many of these diseases also have symptoms that are related to the gut. Our previous speaker was talking about where the research is going in terms of the microbiome and mental health. You can see that it's been in the 2000s, so in this century, that really microbiome research has taken off. And in a very short period of time, we've gone from looking at associative type of studies and moving all the way into commercial products, which started hitting the market about 7 years ago. But if you look at this bottom graph, you'll see that many studies are underway pertaining to the microbiome and mental health. And it's very rare in the nutrition setting that I put up as many disease functions as you're looking at on these slides, but I'm just summarizing for you the literature and really the enormity of the scope, because it's everything from stress all the way through dementia, behavioral issues in children. And I am going to provide copies of these slides, and at the end of the slides I also have all of the references listed. So when we look at the gut-brain connection, some interesting things that also validate what we're talking about. The number of microbes in our body is 100,000 times the number of people on the planet. And when we started sequencing the microbiome, we thought we would find some new species maybe we would discover a new microbial country. What we really discovered is a new planet. If we think of the microbiome as an organ, and to be an organ, it really needs to have these two characteristics. It needs to be essential, and it needs to be inherited. And we know that both of those things are true about the microbiome. It makes it the second largest organ. So it's about, depending on how robust your microbiome is and how big your brain power is, it can weigh up to more than a kilo than your brain. And it just brings it in just after the liver in terms of size of organs in the body, if we consider that. The other really fascinating thing about the gut-brain connection is when we're talking about the the nerve that is the superhighway between the enteric nervous system and the central nervous system. I think we think that the brain is the predominant message sender there, and that the microbiome is the gut is sneaking some signals back towards the brain. But what the researchers have found is that 80% of the nerves are moving downward, and only 10 to 20% are moving upwards towards the brain. So in addition to the fact that the gut produces over 30 different neurotransmitters and is also the largest reservoir of serotonin in the body, it starts to make sense that just treating mental illness as an issue in the brain has been so unsuccessful. And if we look at the clinical literature and kind of an overlap, right, of how the brain develops and the onset and etiology of mental illness, and also how the gut develops, we can see a tremendous overlap there. And then when you mix in the diet and other influential factors, we can look at the overlap and how this development is synchronized and also disrupted over the course of a lifetime. And it starts in the womb and goes through early childhood and on into old age, but also more than old age, we can see that your microbiome ages before you do. Your microbiome is an indicator and a predictor, a strong one, of longevity and quality of life during your lifespan. So how does this all work? Again, we've talked a lot about neurotransmitters. There's a lot about movement up and down the vagus nerve. But the reality is that it's so much more complex than that. The nerve endings that are in the enteric nerve system are not actually in the epithelium. And that means that it is the production of metabolites that cross the epithelium that stimulate the nerves within the enteric nervous system. So it's not just about the organisms that live there, but it's also about their metabolic activity. There's a great deal of criticism for the industry that the science is that the commercialization of these products is eclipsing the science, and there is great emerging science, and there is a lot of products on the market as well. I think that if you heard the last speaker and some of the other speakers today, you'll know that research is accelerating at a fantastical rate. But that being said, some of these areas are still very, very new in terms of the research. And in addition to that, the other great criticism is that a lot of the research is still in animals. And that's true, and some of those studies will continue to migrate to human clinical trials. But remember that when we're talking about the gut-brain axis, there's things that we're able to measure in animal models that we wouldn't be able to look at in human beings for ethical reasons. And so we have a very strong body of data emerging that shows an association between gut health and the microbiome profile, and many significant mental health issues. And stress, behavioral issues in children, more moderate mood conditions, anxiety, and also the development of many of those issues have been studied in human beings, and research continues to be published every day. That being said, because many of these products will never be drugs, we need to understand that there'll never be phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials on some of these preparations. I will say that many of the formulations that exist on the market today, as we look at how the research is emerging, the multi-strain combinations, as we learn more about which strains perform which function in which human beings, the formulating will become more targeted and strain specific. We won't have to, under those circumstances, have some of these mega doses of the probiotic strains. So targeted and more specific strains will certainly be the ones that are most likely to be validated in the clinical literature outside of food poisoning. Food poisoning, it's just an arms race on who can outcompete each other, and so many of those are the multi-strain formulas at high doses. The other factor, as we look at the gut-brain axis, and it's really the gut-brain microbiome, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, they're all interacting with each other. The purpose of the vagus nerve is to connect the enteric nervous system in the gut, which has more neurons in it than the spine, to the brain, and also to manage the traffic along the HPA axis. And so when we have gut dysbiosis, and we have seen this in clinical studies, what it does is lower our threshold for stress management. And everybody has stress. There's no such thing as a stress-free life. If you have one, tell me your secret afterwards. But really, when stress, chronic stress becomes anxiety, anxiety develops into other compulsive, obsessive disorders and depression and other mental illnesses, and it can be a progression. And so lowering our threshold for coping makes us at high risk for developing additional mental and long-term chronic illnesses. This is the greatest. There's a lot of exciting research on epigenetics. It's one of my favorite topics. And this idea that we are more than the genes that we were born with. And it is true that our own genes respond to lifestyle factors that determine whether or not they are expressed or flipped on or off. But the greatest reservoir for epigenetic potential is actually our microbiome. Our microbiome can be modified by diet in a single 24-hour period. The trick isn't modifying our microbiome. The trick is getting the modifications to stick. After we develop our microbiome early in life, it becomes very resistant to change. But the other interesting thing about this study is the look at the influence on the production of amyloid plaques in the brain related to changes in the microbiome. it's not just because we used to say, okay, we see a link between dementia and Alzheimer's disease, but and it's probably related to the microbiome's influence on immunity and inflammation. But the truth is that the very release and accumulation of amyloid plaques is related and can be linked to the different profiles of the gut. Also, stroke outcomes, BDNF factor, which is the factor that creates plasticity in our brain. For most of us in this room, I know that when I had my children, I believed this thing that by the time you were in early childhood, you had developed all of the neural connections you're going to develop in life. And that's one of the things that made brain injuries so challenging, is that you've got what you have, and if you start killing them off through drug abuse or accident or whatever, you'll never be able to recover. But the discovery that our brains continue to form connections, and one of the substances that wash over our brain and help us renew connections and form new ones is BDNF factor, also been shown in studies to be influenced by the microbiome. I mentioned, though, that there's a great deal of products on the market as we're looking at the science more specifically that are making claims today related to the microbiome. I want to showcase some of these products right now. So, products with claims. We've moved beyond mood and support, natural support for stress. You see that a lot of companies are talking about the gut-brain connection. They're even making statements about navigating the traffic along the gut-brain connection. And so that's very, that's a high level of consumer understanding that we expect, that we're expecting from the consumer. And it's also going into territory where we still are developing our understanding of these mechanisms of action, and you'll see more and more products are making mechanism of action claims. This is a list of some of the bacteria that have been studied in the gut and the neurotransmitters that are affected by them. Certainly, we see that, and our previous speaker spoke about 160 different species that may have an impact on stress. These are the ones that occur most frequently in the literature for the most common neurotransmitters. But it's not just about the species, because the healthy functioning of the gut is about balance and diversity. So even individuals that are high in some of these bacteria in the gut, whether or not they have this outcome is related to what else is living in the environment. One of the things that's going to greatly improve the clinical studies and the outcomes in clinical studies is that soon you will see that to be enrolled in these clinical studies, we will be pre-screening the microbiomes of subjects before they go into the studies. And in fact, we're going to see that in many studies, in heart disease, in immunity, in all kinds of mental health studies, as well as traditional digestive research. A lot of the studies, if you look at the meta-analysis, you'll see that they're mixed. And EFSA certainly has a lot of challenges when reviewing these studies. But we are on the advent of better technology as it pertains to conducting these studies. And I have a couple in these slides that I'll send you. I've summarized the clinical literature and the studies that are in human beings. And if we think about where the science is going, just remember that 100 years ago, we believed that most bacteria, it wasn't even 100 years ago, most bacteria are bad. We spent most of the 20th century trying to annihilate bacteria. 20 years ago, we believed that our DNA was the sole reservoir determining our genetic future. 10 years ago, we believed that there was about 100 species of bacteria in our gut. 7 years ago, we believed that when we did sequence it, most people would have about the same, they would have a lot of similarities in terms of their microbiome profile. And what we found is that it's almost as unique as your fingerprint. And 5 years ago, we believed that the gut health was primarily about immunity and digestion. And as we look at the tremendous evolution that's happened over the last 50 years, it's incredible to think about what we will know tomorrow. So this is an area that researchers have a lot, even the most critical researchers have a lot of hope and promise for a variety of mental health conditions and beyond. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today and sharing these insights with our audience.